And now we welcome Shota Gvineria of the Economic Policy Research Center of Georgia. And I apologize in advance if I have mispronounced your name and surname. Good afternoon.
That was a very good try. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, so we've seen the recent events in Georgia's capital. Perhaps for our international viewers, because we have people joining us from all around the world, perhaps you could give us a little overview of these events and why they are happening.
Well, thank you very much for your interest in this, and I really appreciate the time. First of all, I think the most important thing is to understand the process that is going on in its entirety and see the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is that I think the best way to explain what is going on is that Georgian authorities, the government of Georgia, has lost the ability to resist pressure from Moscow, from Russia, and what we call the hybrid warfare is unfolding in front of our eyes. And this is how lost hybrid warfare looks like. When the Kremlin and Moscow is able to control the decision-making process in the country to the extent when the government is no longer able to take the decisions that will not be favorable in Moscow, and they're ready to take decisions that are very clearly against its own country's constitution, are very clearly against the vast majority of the public opinion, are against the national interests of the country in any way you can interpret them, but they still are taking decisions opposed to all this because this is something that Russia and Kremlin wants them to do.
Right. Now, one thing has been absolutely essential in this. We saw it last year, these massive protests in the streets of Tbilisi. We've seen it again now. But I also wanted to ask you, we saw one of the politicians, pretty much cold cock another politician in the parliament yesterday. How is this being talked about in Georgia?
Well, basically, unfortunately, this kind of clashes and even physical, let's say, assault of the politicians from one another is not a very rare exception in Georgia because the society and the political spectrum is so polarized. And I mean the polarization in its worst sense of it, because politics are always polarized, right? There are different polars and there are different parties that support different positions and there are different people supporting different positions. But since they're able to talk with one another and find any sort of common ground or engage in a political discussion without calling each other names and without physically insulting one another, that's okay. But in Georgia, we have basically arrived to the picture where is this two different worlds, two different media realities, two different information environments, if you would say so. And the Georgian Dream ruling party, which is in control of one part of the society, and the TV stations that give narrative which is favorable to the Georgian Dream, and people who still support them because they're deceived through this disinformation and propaganda campaigns a la Russian style, exactly the same way that Russia does its disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And there is another part of society which is left completely outside the political opportunity structure. They are opposed to the government policies. They are opposed to government's attempts to drive the country away from its constitutionally declared Western orientation, and they're opposed to the government's positions and actions to drive country back into the Russia's orbit. But there are very limited possibilities or opportunities for the civil society or political opposition or to the public in a more general sense to influence those policies. Because what we see in Georgia is a one-party rule, and one party basically controls all branches of power. So executive, legislative, judiciary, all economic opportunities are controlled by one party, chaired by one man, and all the sources of power are monopolized by one party. So there is very little space for a constructive political debate or very little space for changing something through a fair political game in Georgia. That's why every time we see the crowds coming out in the streets and trying to pressure and influence the government, because going into the street and organizing a massive protest rally is the only way to somehow influence the decision of the government.
Yeah, and it seems to be effective.
But you mentioned at the beginning that, what we see at the moment is symptomatic of some kind of lost hybrid warfare, and you've described the situation, which is quite difficult, but nonetheless there is some pushback and there is some awareness of what is happening amongst those who are perhaps opposed to the Georgian Dream Party. So can you tell us a little bit about that part of society and their level of awareness?
Yes. And if I may put the legislation, which is now being fiercely opposed by the Georgian society in this particular context of the hybrid warfare, because the scholars, they learn hybrid warfare through two different prisms. One is the ability to control the policy and the decisions of the government, and the other is to control the public opinion, which in functioning democracies is very much interconnected, right? So what we see in Georgia is that Russia succeeded in controlling the government policies and what government does, but they still failed to influence the public opinion. So the public opinion is still very much pro-European, very much pro-NATO, pro-Western, pro-democracy. And that's the main problem. This is exactly in this context that this law is very important, because this law is the tool that government proposed and wants to turn into a legislation which will allow the government to silence that one remaining bastion of freedom, if I may say so, in the country. And this is the legislation that will allow the government to pressure and to basically negatively oppress and influence the free media in the country and the civil society, which is so effective in opposing the government policy. So there are, in these two most important objectives of the hybrid warfare, to influence the policy and influence the public opinion. One is effectively done, checked. The other one is still alive and kicking. So this legislation is very important in terms of having tools to influence free media and the civil society. And that's why the media and civil society are so opposed to this.
Right. Well, we hope that this legislative measure does not make it through. We need to stop and end it there. Shota Gvineria, Economic Policy Research Center of Georgia, thank you very much for joining us and shedding light on this important matter. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest.